And joining us with more on tonight's topic is Janelle Irwin, political reporter for FloridaPolitics.com, who recently did some terrific reporting by living on the minimum wage for a month. Rod Thompson of the Thompson Group. And joining us by Skype is Florida businessman Tal Zlotnitsky, chairman and the CEO of iControl Data Solutions. And he is also a member of a group called the Patriotic Millionaires for Fiscal Strength. Thank you all for joining us. And Tal, let me start with you, because if you could tell us for a moment about the Patriotic Millionaires. And as I understand it, it is a group of CEOs and other very successful people who are actually lobbying for an increase in the minimum wage. Is that not correct?
That's correct. The group was formed a few years back by a group of people who are primarily business people interested in creating a society that's more balanced and creating more fairness. We initially approached it from the standpoint of advocating an increase in our own taxes in order to be able to afford some of the things we felt we needed as a society. More recently, we've been advocating for an increase to the minimum wage. In fact, we've come out recently in favor of increasing the minimum wage to $15 by 2020.
Now, Tal, I would imagine that people like Rod are going to say, and the fact you saw in Kate's piece, that the Restaurant Association is concerned that raising the minimum wage is something that businesses and small businesses cannot absorb. How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, look, I think there are a lot of different opinions about how high or low the minimum wage needs to be. I think reality is that everyone recognizes that it's currently just too low. And the question of whether that number should be 10, 12, or 15, I think that question is a question that can be fairly debated. We've come out for 15 because reality is that whether it's rural or suburban, that's about the number that a person needs in order to be able to afford basic needs. In terms of the question of what businesses can afford, reality is that a low minimum wage is really corporate welfare. It's subsidized by the taxpayers because ultimately, as the numbers show, individuals who are earning the minimum wage are consuming a considerable amount of services from the state and the government. So the end result is, and quite frankly, I think it's a very conservative argument. If we're looking for a society where we have people who are more self-reliant and empowered, we're going to need to give people the opportunity to earn a living wage for working full time. It's unconscionable, it's immoral, and quite frankly, it's harmful from a society standpoint as well as an economic standpoint to have people working full time and not earning living wages.
Well, Rod, let me get your response to that.
Well, as far as it being a balance or sort of a redistribution sort of thing, as Tal was talking about there, I disagree with it for that purpose because then, that's a redistribution of wealth. I didn't think was really the goal of a minimum wage. It was to help people live better. But I think that it's important to note that according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that it's only a very tiny percentage of people on minimum wage out of the 2.5% out of those that make hourly wage are on minimum wage. A third of those are teens. A large number of those are second and third. So your example, which is always a strong and compelling example that Kate did, is just that, a strong, compelling example, but it's not reflective of the numbers. It's a very, very tiny percentage that are actually trying to support a family on minimum wage.
Well, let me get you to respond to something that was actually written by the publisher of the American Conservative. His name is Ron Unz, and he also is for the minimum, raising the minimum wage. And he said basically, quote, the bottom line is that the American government right now spends $250 billion a year on social welfare programs to benefit the working poor. I think businesses should stand on their own 2 feet and pay their workers rather than force the taxpayers to make up the difference.
All right, well, here's the problem with that economically speaking. When you raise the minimum wage, there's an upward pressure on all of the rest of the wage structures above that. So if you raise the minimum wage for a stocker at Publix, and then you get up to a team leader at Publix that's worked up to, after 2 years, making $11.50, you raise the minimum wage up to 10 or 12. Clearly, that team leader is going to want to make 14 or 15. His managers, so you have this upward trickle, sort of a trickle-up effect on wages, which then causes everything to become more expensive. And I wonder then if you've actually really benefited the person at the bottom.
Janelle, I want to get to you in a moment, but Tal, could you respond to that for a moment?
Well, I mean, I think it's first of all the premise that this is about redistribution of wealth. I think is a false premise. This is about doing the right thing and enabling Americans who are working full time to live a respectable life. And quite frankly, I think we can't, as a society, continue to encourage people to work and be self-reliant and not provide that floor where people can function and provide for their families. I also strongly disagree with the numbers that were cited. It is in fact about 33% of minimum wage earners are teenagers, but the vast majority are actually not teenagers. They're in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. They're predominantly women, and the vast majority of them are parents. So, you know, at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves what kind of a country we want to be. I mean, if we take the premise that my colleague presented here, why not set the minimum wage at $2 an hour? Because then we could really drive prices down. At the end of the day, it's, you know.
One second, Tal, because Janelle, you did a little experiment and you tried to live on minimum wage for a short period of time. How did that go for you?
It was shocking. You look at it and you think it can't possibly be that hard. But then when you really start breaking down the numbers, you're talking about $17 a day in disposable income, and that includes food. And I have 3 children. So trying to spread that out, even before I began, I immediately knew that it was going to be a challenge. The second day in, my husband had a flat tire. And something like that for somebody who is truly a minimum wage worker, for somebody who's truly trying to make ends meet on that amount of money, that would be catastrophic for them, because that $17 a day is gone. The $85 for the week, it's gone. You're then forced to either not have a car or not have any money for the rest of the week, or maybe even month. And then you're put into a situation where you're relying on public transportation, which, let's face it, in many places is not adequate. So it was really something that made you take a step back and look at it and think, you know, how do people really do this? Now, I'm not here to say on either side which is right and which is wrong, who's right, who's wrong, but from just a scientific experiment standpoint, it's absolutely accurate to say that you can't live on minimum wage.
You know, there was an interesting column recently in the Tampa Times written by John Romano, who basically said that it is a fallacy when people suggest that companies are going to lose workers or not be able to afford to pay them if the minimum wage goes up. And he pointed out 11 years ago that Florida voters voted to change the Constitution and immediately raise the minimum wage, and that people back then thought that Florida would implode under the weight of the extra pay, and that, in fact, did not happen. In fact, that unemployment went down after the minimum wage went up. Rod?
Sure, because again, I go back to, and I would be happy to supply Tal with a link to the Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers on that. But you go back to the idea that it's a very small percentage of people that are on minimum wage. So is it going to tank the economy? No, I don't think that's possible at all, because the numbers are too small. So in the case of Florida, just as in a study that's been often used as an example between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, one that did it and one that didn't at the same time period, the overarching health of the economy is going to drive what the states are doing in the Florida economy far more than what could happen at minimum wage, unless it was a ridiculous increase, because those are just small numbers at the margins as far as the overall economy goes.
Right. Janelle, let me ask you this quickly, because a lot of people do argue that if you are putting more money in the hands of people who could then spend it in the marketplace, that will help businesses in terms of their profits.
During the week that I did this little study, you know, I wasn't able to go and get a coffee in the morning. I wasn't able to go out for lunch at Jimmy John's or wherever. Having that extra disposable income, certainly, yes, I would be spending money in places that I wouldn't have been spending money otherwise. And all of those other people who benefited, they would too. And can I just say about the wage stagnation, that's kind of the point in the Fight for 15 movement, is not just to raise the minimum wage, but also to end wage stagnation in general.
And we'll have to leave it there. I want to thank you all for joining us.